studies that have looked at dermoscopy and basal cell carcinoma, there are many different dermoscopic features that have been identified. What I find to be somewhat helpful, especially for people who are beginning to use dermoscopy, is to simplify the approach based on the clinical appearance of the basal cell carcinoma. And this helps you identify, for this particular lesion, what are the dermoscopic features that are most important in arriving at the correct diagnosis. So for me, I break them up into pigmented basal cell carcinomas. In those cases, the pigmentation is what allows you to arrive at the diagnosis much more than any of the other features. For non-pigmented lesions, there are both raised and flat lesions. For raised lesions, arm rising vessels is almost always the most important feature. And for flat lesions, these are more challenging. But on dermoscopy, the most important features are erosions, vessels, and shiny white structures. So we'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. For pigmented lesions, there are multiple variations in how the pigmentation can appear. So you have blue-gray ovoid nests, dots and globules, leaf-like areas, spoke wheel-like structures, and concentric structures. All of these are essentially variations of where the melanin is distributed in the tumors and the shape and the size of the tumors. There's nothing really unique about these, but they do give you some information as to the histologic subtype. For blue-gray ovoid nests and dots and globules, these are rounded structures, often sometimes oval. Most frequently you'll see blue-gray color, but you can see variations of brown as well as pink. They tend to be non-aggregated, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So here are some of the classic examples of blue-gray ovoid nests. In addition, you can start to see some of the dots and globules. The variation in the color that you see depends on the depth of the melanin within the dermis. So when it's very superficial, it's going to appear more black. When it's a superficial basal cell, you can also see some brown colors. The deeper it goes into the dermis, you start to see gray and you start to see blue. So when you see blue and there are large tumors, it's very likely to be a nodular basal cell carcinoma. If you see brown and very small structures, much more likely to be superficial. In terms of the dots and globules, they tend to be non-aggregated. So you sort of see them haphazardly throughout the lesion. In a way, they sort of remind you of buckshot scatter. And the translation for that, I'm not sure how easy it is, but with like a shotgun, if you shot that and it kind of spreads throughout the lesion. And so that's what it's sort of reminiscent for me. In terms of aggregated versus non-aggregated, aggregated globules we tend to see in melanocytic lesions. They tend to be very tightly clustered together. Non-aggregated globules, you'll see a few here and here, a few here and here, a few here and here, are not all aggregated together. Here's another example of a smaller bluish globule. Another example of dots and globules. Leaf-like areas. This is a very fun one that people like to identify. They tend to be brown, sometimes blue-gray. They tend to have these bulbous blobs that come off the center. But in the center, you don't see a very dark dot. Some of these have leaf-like appearance, and you have to use your imagination to sort of see that. So here's a classic example of a leaf-like structure. And it's quite reminiscent of this particular type of leaf, the maple leaf. You can obviously see many different variations of these leaf-like structures. Sometimes they're a little bit more bulbous in appearance. Sometimes they're really round, and beginners often sort of misidentifying this particular type of leaf-like structure. Some people have said it sort of looks like an ginkgo leaf. Here's another example, more of the roundish, bulbous, as opposed to the very fine projections of the leaf. Spoke wheel-like structures, these are well circumscribed. They tend to be brown, they're very superficial. They have radial projections, and there's a central darker hub, a little dot in the center. You can imagine it's sort of like the leaf, but without the central dot. So these are the best examples I've ever seen of the spoke wheel-like structure. So central little dot, and the projections. Another example. And sometimes they don't really look like spoke wheels, but you can see central dot and you see projections. These particular structures aren't that common. So if you just look at pigmented basal cell carcinomas, the sensitivity is only between 10 and 17%, but they tend to be very specific. So if you identify them, you can be very confident that it's basal cell carcinoma. A variation of the spoke wheel structure is the concentric structure. This is a central dot surrounded by a lighter circle surrounding that. For me, it's really just the same structure, just that the tumor has a slightly different appearance. The power of these structures you can see in the following examples. So here you see a very nice concentric structure. These other pigmented structures, they don't quite fit that classic breakdown as easily. As you go forward though, you can see smaller and smaller examples of basal cell carcinoma that essentially have the same exact structure and allows you to identify very small lesions. This is a recent example from my clinic. This is primarily a pink lesion clinically. On dermoscopy, you see the lesion here. It's mostly pink, but there's a small little area here that I'll highlight. You can see that sort of also appears a little bit like a leaf-like structure. So they can be very useful in these subtle lesions as well. So the next category is non-pigmented rays. And these are the basal cells that you almost really don't need dermoscopy. Most of these can be identified clinically. The most important structure is arborizing vessel. So for me, when I use the term arborizing vessels, what I mean are very in focus, very bright red branching vessels that start thick and then become thinner as they dissipate out. It's very important that they be very in focus and very bright red, because you can see branched vessels in many other types of lesions besides basal cell carcinoma. So here are a few classic examples of what I would describe as arborizing vessels. It starts thick and slowly gets smaller. They tend to be very in focus. Another example, very in focus. You can see how it branches out. Third example. You can also see arborizing vessels sometimes in flat lesions. And so I reiterate what was said earlier, that it's very useful to use dermoscopy, even on lesions maybe that clinically you weren't so suspicious of. So you might think that this is an actinic keratosis in this patient who has a lot of sun damage. But on dermoscopy, you can see a very clear example of arborizing vessel, allowing you to arrive at the diagnosis of micronodular basal cell carcinoma. There's another more subtle example from my clinic highlighting that even in very tiny tumors, you can see the arborizing vessel. So here's the tip of that. This is the lesion right here. So very small, but you see very in focus, and you see projections that are very fine. Now in the periphery, people will often say, well, what about all these vessels, right? That's sun damaged skin. Those are the telangiectasias that you see. And it's good to compare these. They tend to be out of focus. They tend not to be as bright as the vessels you see in basal cell carcinoma. Arborizing vessels have been shown to have a positive predictive value of about 94% for basal cell carcinoma. But you can obviously see these in other types of lesions like I described. Melanoma rarely. Many other types of tumors, anything raised off the skin surface, so cysts, angiofibromas, hydrocystoma, sometimes lymphoma, very often intradermal nevi. They tend to be out of focus, like I said, and not as bright. So the last category are the non-pigmented flat basal cell carcinomas. And often these are the most challenging to identify. And the reason why many of the early dermoscopy studies didn't really incorporate this category. Here, for me, the most important structures are multiple erosions, short fine vessels, and shiny white structures. So, multiple erosions. These are red-orange crustal erosions. Here's an example. This is an obvious example of a larger erosion. But in other lesions, they can be much more subtle. So, just these subtle little orange areas here, all tiny little erosions. Another example. Here's an example of a pink plaque on the leg. Clinically, you can already start to see there's many tiny erosions throughout this lesion. So probably this is going to be most likely basal cell carcinoma. On dermoscopy, you really will see a pink homogeneous background, many small erosions, basal cell carcinoma. Short fine cholangiopages. For me, this is a controversial dermoscopic feature. They're defined as fine, in focus, linear, irregular vessels, sort of serpentine. They can be very hard to capture with imaging. You see them much better during the in vivo clinical examination, in my opinion. But I am concerned about the specificity of this particular structure, as well as the interobserver agreement. You can see this in many other types of lesions. In my practice, I see this most frequently in amelanotic lichenoid keratosis. So here are a few examples that I'm able to provide. So pink lesion, very fine, short vessels. Other lesions, very short, irregular, serpentine vessels. Again. Now, if you look at the studies that have examined this, the interobserver agreement, or the kappa for this particular structure, is approximately 0.07, suggesting that people really don't agree whether the structure is present or absent. Part of that is the limitation with the imaging, but I think also that it's a little bit hard to define. One of the more recently described structures, and one maybe you're not as familiar with, are shiny white blotches and strands. This is a structure that's only seen with polarized light. You can't see it with non-polarized light. And I'm going to define what I mean by blotches and strands. You can break up the white reflective structure into three major subtypes. The first are lines. So these are very short, linear lines. They tend to be oriented at 90-degree angles, like this. Most frequently, that's going to be associated with melanocytic tumors, so melanoma, spits, sometimes lichenoid keratosis. Shiny white blotches and strands, these tend to be a little bit thicker, they're a little bit more haphazard in their shape, they're a little bit longer than lines. For me, I see this very frequently in basal cell carcinoma, very useful. The third type are rosettes, so these are little dots, and I don't really find this structure to be useful for me at all. This is a recent publication from our group in JAMA Dermatology this year. We analyzed the diagnostic accuracy of non-pigmented basal cell carcinoma with shiny white structures, particularly blotches and strands. And basically the main message is that we found it had a relatively low sensitivity, so only about a third of lesions had them, but very high specificity. So we find this to be very useful. I'll show you a few examples. So here's a non-pigmented pathway on the forehead. You can see there's a little erosion here with blood. And here's the polarized image and the non-polarized. So here you can see these sort of irregular, wide, shiny white structures. A good example of the shiny white blotches. Here's the same lesion I showed you before with the short, fine vessels. On polarized dermoscopy, you can see these blotches. Third example on the leg, I often find them, the shiny white blotches and strands for non-pigmented basal cell carcinomas of the lower extremities. So pink lesion here. On non-polarized dermoscopy, you see a little erosion here, so a little hint this may be a basal cell carcinoma. Here are the shiny white structures that you see from non-polarized to polarized. This is probably the best example that I've seen in terms of how it helped me find a very subtle basal cell carcinoma. So this lesion right here is next to an intradermal nevus. When we look at the non-polarized dermoscopy, for me I really see nothing. Nothing here that was very helpful for me. There's the intradermal nevus, this is the basal cell carcinoma. When you toggle between polarized and non-polarized, you see the shiny white structures. That's what helped me identify that particular basal cell carcinoma. So with that, I'll just recap. The way I approach basal cell carcinoma in terms of dermoscopic features are through these three broad categories: pigmented lesions, non-pigmented raised, and non-pigmented flat. For me, non-pigmented flat are the hardest to identify. What I find particularly useful are multiple erosions, short fine vessels, shiny white structures. Any raised lesion, typically arborizing vessels will be present. I find that to be very useful. And anytime you see pigmentation characteristic of basal cell carcinoma, that helps, I think, arrive at the diagnosis. So with that, I thank you for your attention.